Hey, ho, let's go listen to the Stick to Wrestling podcast. My name is John McAdam, and if you give us 60 minutes, we will give you a wicked good wrestling podcast. On a little bit of a personal note, we're recording this the very end of July 2019, and it is hotter outside than the Stick to Wrestling crowd when they see the show is going to be 65 minutes. Sean, my convivial co-host, how are you today?
Doing well. I was watching some Southeastern earlier. I had the Troy T. Tyler line, but I messed it up, so it doesn't really matter. But I'm doing well as a whole, despite the fact of what our topic is this week. But I'll put that off as much as possible and talk about our website, which currently we have a discussion going on about how Harley Race treated his bounties tax-wise.
I saw that. As a matter of fact, here's a teaser. By the time this show comes on, both myself, Sean, and our producer, Luke Hippelman, will be putting up our top 10 favorite wrestlers of all time on the Stick to Wrestling Facebook page. By the way, I want to thank the Ramones for writing that song about their favorite podcast, Stick to Wrestling. They're big fans. They listen every week. Sean, have you ever seen the Ramones in concert?
I have not. The Ramones, a little before my time, John.
They were still touring in the 90s. I saw them 3 times, and every time the lead singer, Joey Ramone, was more and more out of it. So I don't know when I'm going to see him a 4th time because I'm afraid what might happen to the guy. Not a good trend.
Mr. CBGB, John McAdam.
There you go. And one last thing I want to two last things I want to plug. Number one, if you'd like to follow me on Facebook, just put in the name John McAdam and follow the guy who has a guy hitting another guy with a chair on his avatar. And with that, I also want to thank my friend Matt Brown from hotboxcards.net for being part of the show, for being our sponsor for the last 4 weeks. We really appreciate it. Hotbox Cards, it's really cool. It's a monthly sports card subscription service, baseball and football cards. They are offering a one-time product called the Hot Tag Wrestling Box, which contains everything that a regular box has, plus chances at autographed 8x10s, 1950s exhibit cards, and 1982 Wrestling All-Star cards. If you use the code, it makes me sad, and I'm saying this for the last time, Wicked Good, you will receive an extra unopened pack in their Hot Tag Wrestling Box. Wrestling boxes are not shipping until August 12th. If you're listening to this, it's already August, so we're right around the corner. Once again, it's www.hotboxcards.net. Once again, .net.
John, when does this deal last till?
It lasts until sometime in August 31st. Thank you. Yeah. All right.
What were you asking? I'm sorry.
No, I told you if I forget anything, don't be afraid to jump in. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Now, the topic that we're going to be discussing, which Sean has been flat out erect about since I mentioned it to him, is the summer of 1994. There was good and there was a lot of bad, and we'll go over it. And I want to go over it with our guest. He was on the show recently. He was a sensation. I actually asked him to come on kind of not last minute, but kind of last minute. Max Levy, the great Tamalie. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well, and glad things went well enough last time that you've invited me back, and pretty quickly afterwards too. So happy to join you guys.
They went spectacularly well. It was an extremely well-received show, and we thank you for coming on again. Sean, we are going to be talking about the summer of 1994. I can't believe—
What are you doing to me?
A lot of things. I can't believe it was 25 years ago, because it was like the third phase of wrestling for me. The first phase was like 75 through 84, the territories. Then it was the WWF dominance period where Vince McMahon wiped out pretty much all of the territories. Now we're kind of in stage 4 that has
the nadir.
The what?
The nadir.
Okay. Now we're kind of in stage 3 where the WWF fell off a cliff in 1992. They've made a little bit of a comeback, but the WWF was not what it once was. And I mean, we'll get into that a little bit later, but like I said, this being 25 years old makes me feel very old.
Not what it once was.
No.
To say the least. I mean, wow. But point to be made, it was such a different world 25 years ago. I was about 7 or 8 months away from getting on the internet, and that's something that changed everything. And I'm sure there's a younger person listening that can't even imagine what it was like during that time, because everything is so web-based now. And Max, you told me before the show that you didn't have internet yet, except for college, which doesn't count. And what was the life of a wrestling fan like, who was not connected to the internet, who was not connected to any of the newsletters? What was it like in 1994?
It was really boring in 1994 because, the only thing that we could get, in this market, Minneapolis, St. Paul, in 1994 for TV wrestling was WWF and WCW. And I did some checking, and in November of 1986, just on free-to-air TV, not even cable, we could get 15 hours of pro wrestling in a single weekend, and you could get AWA, WWF, Crockett, UWF, World Class, Continental, Pro Wrestling This Week, Central States, Memphis. And by August of 1994, we could get 3 hours of wrestling a week on free TV. WWF Challenge, WWF Spotlight, and Worldwide Wrestling. And on top of it all, Worldwide Wrestling and Challenge were on at the same time on different channels. So there wasn't much to see. And, as far as what was going out there in the greater world of wrestling, I wasn't on the internet yet. I didn't have the newsletters yet, and was in a situation where, I was watching, what little I had taped from, the glory years of a few years before. And then, also, scouring the wrestling magazines, trying to find out what was going on, out there in the wrestling world, what was happening in, Memphis, what was happening in Smoky Mountain, starting to hear about ECW for the first time and wanting to be able to see it, but then not really having any opportunity, not plugged into tape trading, and not being in a position where, now if you want to know what happened at some house show last night or some big indie card over the weekend, you just, jump on Twitter and, jump on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and instantaneously. And, back then, you were in a spot where you might have to wait weeks or even months to find out about what happened. And, if it didn't wind up in a wrestling magazine somewhere, or you didn't know, somebody who knew something, or you didn't call the right hotline, you may just completely miss it. I mean, there's stuff that happened in 94 that, I didn't find out about until years and years later.
The hotlines where you have to sell your house to be able to afford those things. Sean, how about you? Where were you in 94 wrestling wise?
Well, importantly, 94, literally, I would have been living in Kenmore Square, right in Kenmore Square as a sophomore at Boston University. So wrestling wasn't really on my radar at that point. We had internet, but it was minimal. It was more like the RSPQ groups. The little, it's almost hard to describe them. They were so primitive for the time. Mm-hmm. And so that was pretty much it. The product was terrible. Unless you lived in Pennsylvania, Tennessee, or Kentucky, the product was just god awful. And as far as communication goes in wrestling, outside of the little on-site groups I was telling you about, the only thing I've seen was the aftermags, and at that point they were reporting on Garvin and Jake Roberts fighting over the TV title.
Well, you could live in Tennessee, Kentucky, or Pennsylvania, or you could live in my world where, I would record WWF and WCW. I'd record all of it because I wasn't going to sit there and watch it live. And I would sit there with my fast forward button, just, okay, if there's a decent match or maybe an interesting angle, I would make, best of WCW and WWF tapes. But I remember specifically like fall 84, I had two TVs set up. One of them I'm kind of fast forwarding wrestling, and the other one I'm watching football on. But I remember, WCW, they had, I want to say 4 hours of TV a week. They had a Clash of the Champions. They had a pay-per-view. And it took me like 3.5 months to have a decent 4-hour compilation tape of them because they stunk so bad. And that's how I think that was more like early '84. But yeah, they were terrible. But in my world, I was a little bit luckier because every 4 weeks in the mailbox, I would get a tape of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And every 4 weeks, I would get a tape of ECW, which was still in its very early days. And Smoky Mountain was the one I looked forward to the most. And it was ridiculous. I was ridiculous. The tape would arrive. I would run in, and I would immediately want to watch it. And I'd be like, okay, this time you're going to watch one episode today, one episode tomorrow, etc. And every time I would believe this. And then, of course, that night I would watch all 4 hours of Smoky Mountain Wrestling because I enjoyed it that much. And we'll talk a little bit about Smoky, but this, to me, summer of 1994 was where the arrow started pointing downward for Smoky. And summer of 94, almost 25 years ago to this day, I went on, listen to this, a 10-day tour with Smoky Mountain Fan Week. I was down there, I think, for 12 entire days. And it's one of those things. It sounds good. Wow, 12 days of wrestling. This will be fun.
No, it doesn't.
Day 8 or 9, I was dying. I'm like, why didn't I just take the one weekend option that they were offering? But anyway, Sean, what would you like to talk about Smoky Mountain Wrestling, summer of 1994 first?
Yeah, I would agree with you. 94 was probably, I'd say, like right around the peak and heading downwards. And I was going to ask you about that because I didn't see it at the time. I kind of saw ECW a little bit at the time, but I didn't see Smoky Mountain until years later. And as you said, it's compelling. You would watch 3-4 episodes at a time, and I've gone through 93, which is fantastic. Yes. And I'm starting to get into 94 now. What caused what you're talking about, the downfall, outside of the obvious where, money and stuff like that? What about the product itself?
There were a couple of things, and I want to point out that I love Jim Cornette, and every time I've been around Jim Cornette, he's been really good to me. I'm not saying anything bad about him. Every booker has a shelf life. And Jim, he was not only the booker, he was the promoter. And I promoted wrestling very briefly in 92 and 93, very briefly. And I understood how this business could grind you down into nothing. And Jim had been at it, I want to say, for 2.5, 3 years at this point, again, both as booker and promoter, and you could tell it was starting to grind him down. But anyway, I was at the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Fan Week for the whole thing. Jim held kind of a press conference in 94 where he sat down for a couple of hours and he took questions from everyone on the trip. It's probably on YouTube, and that guy asking all of the good questions sitting next to what would be his future wife is me. But anyway, I was sitting right next to Stacy. Stacy's really cool. And we went, I remember the first night was a Friday night, and we went to see the Night of Legends at the Knoxville Civic Coliseum. And it was one of the best shows I'd ever seen. Have you guys ever seen that show, like on tape or anything?
I've seen bits and pieces. I've seen what have I seen? I've seen Rock and Roll Express against Candido and Lee, and I know I've seen, I think it was Orton and Slater against Stomper and Garvin at some point, and of course I've seen that was the show that had the Chris Jericho blade job, right, where it looked like he was going to die.
It looked like he was either going to die from blood loss or he was going to die from drowning because he was that covered in it. I mean, I remember I was at the event. It was the most bloody I have ever seen a wrestler before or since live. And I had no idea to this day, I have no idea really what went wrong. Chris broke his arm the morning before the show, and he's out there wrestling with an arm that he broke like 12 hours earlier.
Yeah. How did he break his arm? Do you remember?
I do. He was practicing. He asked Jim Cornette, hey, is it okay if I practice a few moves for tonight? And Cornette said, yeah, just don't hurt yourself. And there's the jinx right there. He was doing a moonsault. He landed incorrectly and broke his arm.
I have to believe that that him trying to tell Jim that he'd broken his arm had to be a pretty fun experience of Jim going full cornet on him.
I mean, according to Jimmy, at first he's like, "Yeah, you're real funny, nice rib," and then he found, no, the arm's broken. The Thrillseekers were going to win the tag team titles on that night, and it was going to be the start of a big push for them. And it basically, they felt like they couldn't change the titles, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for the Thrillseekers. I was always really impressed by Chris Jericho. I mean, I was saying crazy things like, if I were WCW, I'd bring this guy in and build around him. I always saw something in him, and to this day, he's one of my favorite wrestlers. Any Jericho thoughts from you, Max?
It was kind of an interesting thing when he wound up in WCW. That was, really my first real chance at seeing him. And it was pretty clear, that even though they had him kind of, doing the white bread babyface thing, jumping around, getting super excited, almost to the point of parody, you could see by the look and by what he could do in the ring that he had the ability, and all they had to do was cut him loose. And then when he finally went heel at the beginning of '98, I mean, he went from being just another guy to being one of the biggest, hits of the entire company, probably in a month, if not quicker than that. So, I, could totally see, why you would want to build around him. And it is, just another typical WCW thing that, they had this guy sitting there. It took forever to really try to do something with him, and then never let him go far enough that he would have wanted to stay there when he could have been a huge asset to them. By the way, didn't the thing with the blade, wasn't the deal that I don't know if he was like right-handed and it was the right hand that was broken or the right arm that was broken, but didn't he try to blade with the broken arm? Or maybe because the dominant arm was broken, he tried to blade with the non-dominant arm, and somehow that wound up playing into him gigging wrong and getting the blood shower, basically.
That's always has been my theory, that if my left hand is basically left arm and hand are basically useless. I do everything right-handed, and I think if I tried to do something like cutting myself with my left hand, it wouldn't go well, to say the least. One thing about Jericho in WCW, he overcame a major obstacle, and as soon as they did this to him, I'm like, oh God, they just killed him. They made him a cruiserweight, and to me, that's like the kiss of death to a wrestler. But obviously, it wasn't. Guerrero overcame it. Benoit overcame it. Jericho overcame it. Any thoughts, Sean? Chris Jericho, Smoky Mountain or non-Smoky Mountain?
Well, I'm just looking at. I was looking at the results for the Night of Legend. I do remember the card, but I'm looking at the names who were there. I was going to ask you about that. I'm looking at Bob Armstrong. How many of these guys were actually there? Corsica Joe was named. Jack Donovan. Ronnie Garvin was there. Because I remember he wrestled. Bob Orton Jr. Dick Slater was there. I mean, just this was something that really one of two things that Jim Cornette did here that was different. Well, I guess it was kind of a throwback, but it was the almost community involvement. Was the bringing back the memory. I see Jim White here, who is Jerry Lawler's old tag team partner. These are folks in Knoxville, they're going to know from way, way back. Ron and Don Wright. Billy Wicks, who had the famous feud with Sputnik Monroe. Frank Morrell, who has been around Tennessee for a bazillion years. That was one thing, and the other is his use of the internet.
In '94?
And his use of like the shoot interviews, the tape trading guys, not necessarily the internet, but like involving you guys into this. The media, the media per se, the legit media.
I mean, I know Cornette has always been friends with Meltzer, always meaning like going back to the early 80s. So, I mean, he always got favorable coverage from Dave, as a result. And, I mean, what's there not to favorably cover, at least at the beginning of Smoky Mountain Wrestling? It was awesome. But here's where I think the turning point was. The next night, we are in Johnson City, Tennessee, and they have been heavily hyping a match between the Rock and Roll Express and the team of Brian Lee and Chris Candido, who were managed by Tammy Fytch. Now, well, they called her Tammy Fytch there, excuse me. And the stipulations of the match were that if the Rock and Rolls lost, Ricky Morton was going to get his head shaved. If the Lee Candido faction lost, it was going to be Tammy Fytch who got her head shaved. So I'm there in Johnson City. They have the match. Ricky Morton gets screwed and pinned. And here's the thing. I was there. Everyone around me was like, there's no way Ricky Morton's getting his head shaved. We're getting screwed. There's no way. And they were right. And it was almost like the response among the people around me who were from the Johnson City area and went to the show was like, it was almost like they couldn't – this was the promotion they could trust at first. Yeah. But now it's like that's gone.
Jim knows better than that. That's East Tennessee. You can't do that. What was the excuse for doing that?
The excuse was that Morton sat down in the chair and he was ready to get his head shaved, and Chris Candido kept taunting him, and Ricky lost his temper, and the Rock and Rolls beat up Lee and Candido, and they put Candido in the chair and shaved his head, which Jim told us that he thought was going to make the crowd happy. Ah, ha, ha, Chris Candido got his head shaved. Well, first of all, Candido had a crew cut anyway. And then it got even worse. The clippers did not work. And so Candido didn't even get his head shaved.
You can't lie to him. I mean, that one of the problems when Ron Fuller went in there was that he ran into was the fact that you had so many – you were having replacements in a lot of the cards. So they didn't trust you anymore.
Yeah.
And that's a killer in East, like, in that, especially that area. If you promise something, you better give it to him. Jim should know, that wasn't going to fly. Even if it does sound logically, but I mean, it's not going to work there.
Yeah.
And it was easy enough just to say, hey, we're going to do Ricky and Robert against Lee and Candido, and whoever loses the fall loses the hair, and then people probably are figuring that it's going to be Candido, but at least then you're giving them what you told them you were going to give them. You might think, well, it's not going to draw as much as promising Tammy's hair being on the line, but then if you don't screw the fans, even if you don't draw quite as many for that August show, then maybe you're going to still do okay in September, October, November, instead of people thinking like, SMW is a ripoff, we're just going to stay home.
Yeah, I mean, and the worst part for me was, like, I mean, not to be repetitive, but as soon as, Morton lost his hair, everyone was like, okay, here it comes. There's no way this is going to happen. And, it wasn't like they were like, oh my God, this happened. Wow, this is weird. It was like, here it comes.
Was it ever on the table and they changed their mind?
What's that?
To have Ricky shave his hair, or they just had the funny finish?
I can tell you there was no way Ricky Morton was going to let them shave his head. There was no way that was going to happen.
Well, it just seems crazy then to try that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bait and switch, and not a particularly good one.
So how was
no way.
How long were you out there in '94? Was it a week?
How long was I out?
Yeah, you went out when you went out for the your trip out there.
I left on a Friday morning and came back on a Sunday night, so that's like 11 days.
How many shows did you see?
We saw one show every night, and even that got old because a lot goes into it. Because Brian Hildebrand was in charge of the Fan Week, but he was also kind of in charge of the shows as an agent. He had to get there early, so we all had to get to the arenas early, and there was a lot of time spent on this rickety old bus that one day just stopped working, and we're on the highway doing like 35, 40 miles an hour. And that was the day we're like, okay, me and my friend said, okay, we're getting a rent-a-car. Enough. By the way, I have a cute story about that. One thing, when I went to the Night of Champions, I was told, look out for this guy, New Jack. I'm like New Jack City, the movie. I'd never heard of him before. And one of my friends, like, no, you should see this guy's promos. And he went out Night of Legends, and he did a promo that blew me away. I couldn't believe what this guy was saying. I couldn't believe the gimmick. It was him. And who was the other guy?
Mustafa.
Mustafa Saeed, they were calling him.
Oh, he was terrible.
He was. And
he put across a good Maniac act, though.
Fair enough.
True. And they came out with, they announced, because these guys don't trust the police, they have their own security crew. So you've got 6 guys in the ring looking like they just came out of a Singleton Brothers movie. And the people in East Tennessee were not digging this, man.
You want to know how intense it was? That, get this sentence. When they got to ECW, Paul toned them down.
Oh, yeah.
When you ever say that about Paul? Paul's usually going the opposite direction. This was so intense that Paul had to bring the fire down.
Yeah, it was crazy. They got a ton of heat. I mean, Max, anything you want to share with us about your thoughts on the Gangstas?
Well, I mean, I've seen the promo from Knoxville, that first one when they came in, and I have to admit that it was stuff I didn't think I would ever see or hear on a mainstream wrestling show. And mind you, I'm seeing this, a couple years after the fact, at which point, New Jack is a babyface in ECW. But I wonder, was it maybe too much heat for East Tennessee and Kentucky and Virginia and West Virginia, to the point that, instead of wanting to see the Gangstas, get beat by the Rock and Roll Express or the Armstrongs or whoever, maybe people just thought, man, I don't even want to watch this. It's just too much.
I think it is the latter. And as much as I enjoyed it, and I did enjoy seeing it every week, I agree with you. I think it was just too much, and more people were turned off by it than turned on by it. But I did promise to share a story. After we rented this car, we stopped at McDonald's, and if you ordered whatever meal, they gave you a Barbie doll, right? So we drive to the show in Saltville, Virginia. This place is like something out of a 1950s movie or a 1950s TV show. It was a place that time had completely left behind. So I walk up to Brian Hildebrand with this Barbie doll, and I'm like, hey, I want you to give this to New Jack and say it's a peace offering from the fans in Saltville, Virginia. Brian looked at me like I was the craziest person on earth. And he's like, John, this guy is crazy legit. I'm like, just tell him the truth. Tell him a bunch of coal miners gave it to you. And he's like, all right, I'll try it. Well, it was a TV taping. And I was so proud. New Jack comes to the ring with this Barbie doll in his mouth. And he believed it was legit, by the way. That was a peace offering. And he comes to the ring with the Barbie doll in his mouth, and he spits it out in front of the camera. I was so proud of myself.
My ECW mind happened to hit here. I'm sitting there. Once you said the Barbie doll, I'm sitting there thinking, hey, I could use it for a weapon. I can give it to the, I could give it to the guys. But it was... How much do you think that could have possibly been one of the turning points for them too? Was that it just got too intense?
I think that didn't. I think the whole thing, and again, I enjoyed it, but the whole thing with the Gangstas, I think, backfired. I can't recall if it created any tension with any of the television shows. I know they had anytime New Jack opened his mouth, they had something on the bottom of the screen saying, these do not reflect the views of the television station of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. So I just thought.
To go back to what I was saying about the media friendly part of it, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You have Brian Hildebrand coming by, picking all you guys up. I'm trying to picture Big Jim Hess or Harry Thornton. Come on, get in the van. Yeah, it's not going to happen in the old days. This was kind of the outreach that is common now. You basically can thank Jim Cornette for stuff like the WrestleMania week,
True.
Or every fan fest for that matter.
Well, I mean, wrestling's changed. I mean, now people will pay big money to go out and rub elbows with even, the C-level stars, never mind the top guys. I mean, it used to be that you could just go walk up to a wrestler and say hello, and if he thought you were cool or whatever, or someone gave you the nod, yeah, he's okay. It was easy, and they tell you stuff. And now, because of the internet, they know better.
True.
So anyway, Smoky Mountain, enough talked about with them. ECW. let's start with something that happened in the summer of 1994. I get home really late on a Saturday night, and there's a couple of messages on my answering machine, and it's from two people who were at the ECW arena. And one of them was like, hey, if you get in at a reasonable time, give me a call. You're not going to believe what happened tonight at ECW. And then I get another one. He's like, hey, call me tomorrow. You need to hear about this. And it was the night that Shane Douglas, they had a tournament for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, which was won by Shane Douglas. And Shane Douglas proceeded to, Ric Flair wore this belt, Ricky Steamboat wore this belt, Terry Funk, and they can all go to hell, and he slams the belt down. And it was the double cross. And here's the thing, the head guy in the NWA, or at least one of the head guys, was a friend of mine named Dennis Coralluzzo. And I can only, at the time I was like, oh my, as soon as I heard this, I immediately called Dennis, and in a way I'm glad I got his answering machine. I just told him, hey, I heard about what happened last night, man. Paulie's an asshole, and, hang in there. So any thoughts, Max, any thoughts on that infamous double cross that occurred on that night in the ECW arena?
Well, I, heard about it, read about it really through the magazines, a few months after it occurred, when it was happening in August of 94, I was completely oblivious, and we were not even getting ECW on TV around here yet. What I remember thinking though, when I read about it was, I'm looking for the right word for this. I mean, to me, the NWA had been, big arenas and all these territories everywhere, and these, big stars, Race, Flair, Rhodes, Von Erich, go back to the Funks and Fez and so forth. And, to me, Eastern Championship Wrestling, having a tournament in, this, little ECW arena or whatever it was called, and trying to, claim it was for the NWA world title. I mean, even if it was, in a legal and linear sense, the same title, to me, it didn't have any legitimacy. I didn't quite get what Extreme Championship Wrestling, was meant to be or what it was going to be. But when, Shane threw it down and declared, the ECW, title, a world title and so on, to me, it didn't feel like, this great, affront as a pro wrestling fan to tradition and the title and stuff like that, because I didn't really think of the NWA world title as really being worth anything at that point, and didn't see anything wrong with them going off and making their own title. That said, I had no idea about the politics behind it at the time until much later. I mean, I just naturally assumed the way it went down that it was all, part of the show, and had no idea that, Dennis Coralluzzo and the NWA crew had been, completely screwed over in this whole situation.
Yeah. And I can tell you, as someone who was around Dennis and Paulie together in 1988, like those guys were just oil and water. I cannot imagine them trying to cooperate and make ECW part of the NWA, etc. Sean, any thoughts on the double cross from you?
Well, I had read it I was a couple months away from watching ECW, where I was introduced to John's wonderful tape list. But I had read it on, I should correct myself, RSPW, as Luke thankfully corrected me. I know I'd hear about that. Rec Sports Pro Wrestling. I read about it there. And first of all, I didn't know the belt still existed. Problem number one, and it looked like a Bush League move. It just you're lowering yourself to a level of this. I just didn't make any sense to me. I guess if you knew you were a big indie show goer and you went to all these shows at the time, it was a big deal. But outside of that, it just looked amateurish.
I agree with you, and I'm looking at it from another standpoint. Like I was, promoting in 1993, and Dennis was talking about, reviving the NWA even at that point. And he and I were having a conversation. He's like, yeah, Chris Candido can come up there as NWA champion and defend the title. And I'm like, yeah, Dennis, sure, I'll think about that. And meanwhile, in my head, I'm like, that has absolutely no value. Like the whole NWA concept, like, we have these 10 promoters working under this one belt. It was dead already back then, yet promoters are still doing it. Max, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I can't believe the NWA is still a thing now. I mean, I guess it's got, some sort of name brand value, but I mean, the whole concept of what it was and so forth. And the people who, still think of it as being something take it so seriously and just seem oblivious to the fact that, in the big picture of pro wrestling right now, it really doesn't mean anything. And it didn't mean anything in 1994, even though, we were just a few years removed from Crockett.
I'll go one step further. The NWA could probably thank Paul, because the only reason anybody remembers the NWA title is that stupid incident. I mean, seriously, what other events, like since Ric Flair last held or whatever like that, the last time he was associated with Crockett or those guys, what's the last time what other event have they had that was significant, more significant than the Double Cross?
I can't think of one that was more. Let me throw this one in. Maybe when Dan Severn came to the UFC or was UFC champion, and he was also NWA champion, like maybe that one.
The thing was, he was NWA champion, but I can't remember Dan Severn actually defending that title. I mean,
that was my problem.
He did a time or two.
Yeah, he had the Shane Douglas defense. He'd have the belt for 3 years and with 4 title defenses.
It meant something to the NWA to say we have a real fighter as champion, but if he doesn't actually wrestle, what's it all worth?
He's in another territory.
Territories. I mean, you know what though? Here's the thing: like, if I were running an indie, like, yes, I see value in bringing Dan Severn in. The problem is, how much does it cost? He's Dan Severn.
10%.
Yeah, I'm sure. With the 3% going to Muchnick, obviously.
To give you some, I'm sure Dennis wanted that one. To give you some context about what ECW was like at this time, they weren't what you quite would think of as ECW yet. Paul had just taken over a few months earlier. It's still kind of a tri-state Eddie Gilbert, Paul kind of feel. Tony Stetson's still there. Tommy Pay Your Debts Cairo is still there. So I mean, you still have a lot of the guys. I think they quickly got rid of Matty in the house or whatever he was. So he was still getting rid of some of that stuff, and Paul was still trying to find his way. Now the problem with this is, and the thing that I understand why you do it then. Really, when you're actually a big deal and you have pay-per-views, you're still rolling this out. Now you look like a chub, and not only that, you look like a bully because nobody even knew who the NWA was at that point.
I mean, I think people knew what it was because they were only. Let me see.
They knew enough to say that exists.
No, they knew what it was because they were still calling it the NWA title on TBS in early 1991. So here we are in 94. It's only 3 years later. People are still going to know what it is, or at least what it's called, but I don't think anyone's going to buy it as a world's heavyweight championship anymore.
Well, they even tried to bring it back in WCW in 1992, and they called it I think they called it the NWA title, and were trying their very hardest not to call it a world title. And then that they lost NWA recognition and led to all the nonsense of having the international world title instead of just killing the belt. But even with that WCW thing, being even closer in terms of time, you went from having, I think Flair, Rude, and Barry Windham in 92 to Shane Douglas in 94, and they tried hard to push Shane, and eventually he did get over, and very much as an ECW signature talent. But if you think about the annals of the NWA world title, you're not really thinking of Douglas as being on par with those guys, let alone the big names of the past.
And they had another tournament a couple of months later, and I think Tracy Smothers won it. Am I right?
I'm going to actually look that up. I think you are.
I think it was Candido.
Okay. I think Candido beat Smothers in the final. So, yeah, and then Candido is on Smoky Mountain Wrestling being billed.
Lou just wrote down Chris Candido. Beat you to it, Lou.
Yeah, so then, Candido was on, I think, one episode of Smoky Mountain with the NWA title, and they weren't interested in using it. And I think, given the fact that Jimmy and Dennis were such good friends, that speaks volumes. It's just the concept was dead. The world had moved on from, okay, I promote Georgia, I promote Florida. You're promoting everywhere in 1994, unless you're Smokey. And Smoky, by the way, I just want to throw this out there. My theory behind Smoky Mountain Wrestling has always been this, that Jim formed the promotion with the idea that Ted Turner would get tired of owning a promotion and Jim could just say to him, hey, I have a wrestling program that's already up and running. You could air this at 6:05, on Saturday nights. It'll be a lot easier. We'll just hand you a tape every week. I presented this theory to Brian Hildebrand, and Brian just kind of smiled and said, I'm not going to talk about that.
No, it would have made sense. I mean, WCW, circa, 94, they were already coming back because, they had Hogan in and they were committed to making it work. But, when Bischoff, was given the keys back in early 93, they were hemorrhaging money. The house show business was basically dead. There was nobody there that could draw. They couldn't even draw in the traditional Crockett towns anymore. I could completely see, potentially the, the board and investors, looking for Turner Broadcasting to cut costs and so forth, wanting to, get rid of WCW and, then Smoky Mountain looks like a very nice alternative.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what, the fastest hour out there is about 2/3 of the way gone. Let's talk a little bit about WCW. Hulk Hogan, it was a huge story. Hulk Hogan, it was unthinkable. They sign Hulk Hogan and they build the promotion around him. And I have never been more wrong because I said this is not going to work at all. It is not 1984 anymore, kids. It's 1994. And Hogan was no longer drawing in the WWF. He had gotten a lot of bad press because of the steroid stuff, lying on Arsenio Hall, etc. And it wasn't a success at first, but at least it got people's attention. Like, oh, there's this other wrestling promotion, and hey, Hulk Hogan, the biggest wrestling star of this generation, is now on it. I just can't express what a huge story it was. And it was something that I personally couldn't believe was happening until I actually saw it with my own eyes. Max, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have to admit, Hulk Hogan going to excuse me, frog in the throat tonight. Hulk Hogan going to WCW was just one of those things I never figured would happen. Not even to the extent of actually considering it happening. And then when it actually did happen, it was odd to see. It was even more jarring to see him in WCW in 1994 than it was to see Flair in the fall of 1991 in the WWF, or to see some of the other guys that had made the switches, from one territory or another to the WWF or between WWF and WCW. I'll give them this, if you're going to sign Hulk Hogan and pay him all that money, you should build around him and make him the focus. And it took a while, but it eventually did work. And, they went all in and all out for it. But, there was some bad stuff that they were doing with him in 94 and 95, more or less to, placate him and acquiesce to his wishes before they finally got hot with the NWO thing.
Yeah. Here's the thing with Hogan, my opinion. I understand. I really do understand that Hogan wants to make himself look good. Hogan wants to protect himself in that environment. I get it. And I don't blame him for that. I don't blame him for saying, hey, I'm not going to let you, this promotion or anyone in it, use me to get anything else over. But my problem was always that Hogan, it wasn't just enough that he would look good. He had to make everyone else look bad, and he went out of his way to do it. And it went beyond selfish. Selfish is what I just talked about, doing what he did in the WWF. It was, just going out of his way to bury, for example, Ric Flair. He buried everyone in sight.
Has Flair ever beaten Hogan?
I don't think so. Not without, like, if he did, it was in, late WCW with all kinds of insane interference and shenanigans so that it wouldn't really count as a
It was the pinfall.
What's that?
I said it was the pinfall.
I cannot imagine a scenario where Hulk Hogan would allow himself to get pinned by Ric Flair. I cannot.
Piper put him to sleep twice.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine just Hogan going along with that because, he cares about that stuff. And
why Piper then?
What's that?
Why Piper? Piper put him to sleep twice.
I don't know.
It's a good question.
It is a good question.
I mean, that was a killer. That should have been the feud. Finally, you're going to get to see it, and they botched it because they did have the match in WWF. I don't think it was ever on TV though, or if it was, it wasn't a big deal. And this was finally the feud, and they botched it because they have Hogan. Hogan's got to win 17 in a row. And by the way, the first time I saw Hulk, I believe he was acting in Thunder in Paradise at this point with the lesser talented Jack Lemmon's son. So the first thing I thought of when I saw him is that Hulk looks like he's been in the dryer too long.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he was significantly smaller. The energy was nowhere near what it was. I mean, he was a force of nature back in the day. It may have worked just because of I don't know, just nostalgia, I guess. But the energy was not there. Again, he was a force of nature in the early mid-'80s. And that was gone. And now and granted, he wasn't getting much help. He's getting stuck in there with the Dungeon of Doom. I'm not sure if that was 94 or not. But I mean, that didn't help anything.
Well, Hogan
the beginnings of it were
programs. I'm sorry, Max.
I was going to say, the whole thing. I think you were kind of on it there. With Dungeon of Doom wasn't in effect, but he was working with Sullivan. He was working with Ed Leslie. He was working with Tenta. I mean, they hadn't gone full Dungeon of Doom hokey, but I mean, if you look at the first few months of his run in WCW, once they got done with the Flair thing, he's just feuding with all of the same guys that wound up in the Dungeon of Doom anyway. Yeah. But ultimately, he didn't have somebody like Vince there to authoritatively say this is what we're going to do and this is not what we're going to do. In WCW, Eric Bischoff was going to let Hogan do whatever he wanted, and Kevin Sullivan told Brian Alvarez a couple of years ago or so that basically he was of the mind to let Hogan do what he wanted because he felt like he needed Hogan to trust him, if in case there was things that they wanted him to do later that he might balk at. So Hulk wants Dungeon of Doom. If he wants a bunch of monsters to come at him, to slay, then, that's what Sullivan was going to let happen. And, it just wasn't very entertaining wrestling to watch. Once the novelty of Hogan being in WCW wore off, there wasn't really a whole lot of reason to tune in week to week.
Was this year they had the electric chair match?
Are you talking about the one with Abby?
Yeah.
That would have been 91.
Yeah. 91. Yeah, they all blend together at this point. But this was the comical thing. It seemed, I don't know. It was embarrassing. I mean, it fully became embarrassing this year.
It was embarrassing before that. 93.
I know, but I mean, it
got a lot worse.
It was bad. This is the year that made ECW. Because ECW became acceptable because everyone went into full rebellion. The product was so bad this year.
That is true. There's definitely truth to that. That ECW fans, at least at first, were fans that were completely frustrated at the WWF and WCW product. I mean, like me. That's why I was
one of them.
Going crazy.
That's what's fueling AEW now. Is people are frustrated with the WWE. There's nothing else on the North American scene. So, AEW is here. Let's go all in. Just like people in 94, 95 went all in on ECW because WWF and WCW were so awful.
I mean, that is an excellent point. Think about this. AEW put out a pay-per-view at $49.95. That's 5 months of WWE Network, and yet it got just under 1 million buys. So it's almost like people are ready for something new. I hope that works out.
Who was? Let me ask you, John. Who was? Since we have to talk about this two crap years from these two, who was doing the actual booking for the two organizations? Because amazingly, as much as we're crapping on WCW, they were the better of the two. Lou just told me that Flair did get a couple of wins against Hogan, but it pretty much proves the point that none of us can remember any of them. I mean, you can count the amount of losses Hogan took in his entire WCW run on one hand, probably. But who was actually putting the matches together? WCW, did they have one of their committees?
Yes.
It was. I think Sullivan was heading the committee. I know that he had a lot of influence, if nothing else.
It never dawned on them that this hasn't worked yet in several years?
Doesn't matter.
Of course not. Yeah, why bother, Jim or the pizza man. So and then WCW, it's Vince. Is there anyone outside of Vince? Is there a George Scott or somebody around?
Well, Patterson was there, and I know that when Vince was, threatened with potentially going away to college for a couple of years, that Pat got a lot more involved with the booking. I know that at some point in '94, Jerry Jarrett was very involved with the booking.
Almost like when they brought in that the coach for Belichick. You remember, John? They brought in that head coach as an assistant because they thought Belichick was going to get suspended over Spygate.
Oh, that's right.
Dom Capers, I think it was. So what happened in '95? I mean, is this their worst year up until this point?
No, I would actually say 1993 was worse. Even though
1995 got worse than '94. 94 was better.
What was the problem
in '93?
The whole thing. Why was it going to hell in a handbasket? I mean, there was the steroids trial, of course, so Vince was clearly distracted. What else was the problem? What else was going on at that point that caused the product to be so terrible?
The talent, I think, was a lot of it was the talent turned over so quickly. I mean, if you look at '92, Hulk Hogan, disappeared after Mania, but Ric Flair aside, a few other guys. For the most part, there's a lot of guys around in '92, even as the ship was sinking, that people had seen in 91, 90, 89, and then compare a card in the WWF in '93, '94 to say '91, and it's just night and day. And imagine if you had a TV show that you like to watch every week, and then suddenly 80% of the cast was changed. You might get turned off. And I think that not seeing Hogan, not seeing Warrior, Savage, being around just as a commentator. And then, even some of the underneath guys, disappearing. Duggan, went away during '93. I think it just got to the point where there were so many new people, and then the booking wasn't very interesting because they doubled down on the family entertainment stuff and getting things, extra kid-like and goofy. It just, all these things together just, combined to drag the ship further down to the seabed.
I want to bring up something, Tamalie, you mentioned. You said Ric Flair going to the WWF was a big deal, and we're comparing it kind of to Hulk Hogan right now. It felt like Ric Flair and Sting and the Road Warriors and Barry Windham and Lex Luger all going to the WWF. During the late 80s, early 90s, it all seemed like an inevitability, and it was, with the exception of Sting. That was the way the wrestlers went. I used to be on a radio show once a year, and every year someone would ask me, when is Ric Flair going to the WWF? When are the Road Warriors going to the WWF? I was never asked, when is Hulk Hogan or Randy Savage going to WCW? So in a way, that's what made it like even a bigger surprise. It was just, not what we were used to seeing at all.
Yeah, people, you don't think of somebody like leaving the championship team to go to the second place team. And, people leave elsewhere and, go to the Yankees, or now they go to the Red Sox. You don't think of, somebody leaving the Yankees or the Red Sox, to, go play for the Indians.
Yeah, Ohtani comes to play in the United States, but we're not going to see, one of the best baseball players go to play in Japan. It was like that.
Mm-hmm.
It had even with all the crazy characters they would try to roll out in WWF, it had a weird sterilized feel.
Yes,
it feels like Times Square after Rudy got there. You have all the little chains, and this is what market research said will work. So as crazy as they tried to make it, it got blander. Which I mean, I don't know how that's possible. So, John, run me over a couple of highlights from WWF '94. I guess this wasn't the worst year of theirs of all time.
Oh, I mean, '94 WWF highlights. Let me think.
We have 10 minutes. You have plenty of time.
It was a really bad year. I mean, it was good that Bret Hart was getting pushed. It was good that Shawn Michaels was getting pushed.
Why were they getting pushed?
Because the guys
didn't look like pumped up steroids guys. That's why.
Oh yeah, I mean, remember '92? You had your Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage wearing shirts into the ring.
Oh yeah, those guys all disappeared fast.
Oh, that's why they hit. One reason why they hit the iceberg so hard in 1992 when all that went down. And once again, we are down to like 5 minutes. I have something to talk about, but really quickly, Tamalie, any thoughts on WWF 1994 or summer of '94?
I mean, the best part about it was definitely Bret versus Owen. I mean, they had two of their best workers constantly working with each other, and who knew each other and could trust each other. So they had great match after great match. I mean, there were some things to like. Shawn Michaels was cool. We didn't really know Kevin Nash at that point, so Diesel had a cool vibe to him that he kind of lost later. But there was just a lot of goofy stuff going on in the WWF that year, and the whole fake Undertaker thing. That the initial deal where DiBiase brought the Undertaker back, and it was this big shock, was pretty cool. But then they just didn't know what to do about following it up.
No, they didn't. Sean's any thoughts from you? WWF 1994.
Yeah, pretty much Owen and Bret, and I mean the fake Undertaker thing. Whose idea was that? Was that Ross?
I don't specifically know whose idea it was. At first, I'm like Tamalie. At first, it sounded like an interesting idea. Brian Lee as the fake Undertaker, and it just did not work long term. One of the first things they did, they had DiBiase come out with the Undertaker. I remember they did it really well. It was like they gave you the slightest hint that it was a fake Undertaker, and I'm like, they just gave you that little bit of doubt, and I thought they did a good job with that.
Well, I mean, that's all well and good. The Brawl for All looked great on paper, too. But the devil's in the details. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, once they actually, a good idea is a good idea, but you have to execute it still. And this is the stuff they weren't doing. It was like they would have it would start off good. It would die down. It would, everything was sterilized. They were afraid they were almost booking out of fear. Just trying to don't offend anybody.
Well, hey, I mean, welcome to what the world has turned into. One quick thing I wanted to mention about the Bret versus Owen feud. I started watching that feud. I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. Brothers don't fight like this. And I saw Bret. I forget where I saw him, but it was outside of like a wrestling bubble. He was like on a talk show or something. And he said, it was during this period when he was feuding with Owen. And he's like, yeah, I was really surprised that a lot of people have come up to me, fans, and said, yeah, I totally understand this feud because my brother and I haven't spoken for 10 years. We don't get along. I won't go to Thanksgiving if he's there. And I was just like, wow, this goes on in the real world, but apparently it does.
It's basically the Bruno and Larry feud in a different context, but it's the same thing. It's Bruno
and Larry weren't related though. That best friends have a
but it doesn't matter. But it's the same thing though. The idea that Bret is overshadowing the younger brother, just like Bruno was overshadowing Larry. It's the same context. You're just changing the relationship a little bit.
Yeah, that resentment that builds up.
Exactly.
I'm sure there's resentment that builds up. Jose Canseco had a twin brother named Ozzy who wasn't that good. But, I mean, they didn't go to war with each other.
Hey, it happens. I mean, I know it seems weird to us, but, if people let emotions get away from it, I mean, it does happen. It's not unknown, unheard of. It's biblical.
True, very
Cain
true.
and Abel.
But I mean, I can tell you this, like, I have a brother, and if he and I, like, stopped getting along, my dad would have put a stop to that shit. He wouldn't have tolerated that.
Yeah, but you forget who their father is. That's why it kind of makes sense.
Nah, that's true.
They kind of build in that competitive, and they always go to that card whenever they have one of these weird, this wouldn't happen. And then they'll answer back, the wrestler will answer back, well, we're competitive in a certain way that you don't understand.
For what it's worth, even though, I think obviously Brett and Owen, were as close as could be, I kind of get the feeling that a lot of the resentment that they had Owen as part of the feud put across in 94 and so on was like legit coming up from Bruce. I think Bruce really wishes that he had the career that, Brett has had, or that, that Owen had, and so on. And I think the fact that he never made it out of Calgary and so on really eats at him. So
with that family, it makes
within
sense.
The heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, I want to make one final point before we go off the air. SummerSlam 94, we talked about it. It was real Undertaker versus fake Undertaker, which sounds stupid coming in. But what built this up, at the Royal Rumble in January, they did a deal where the heels took the urn away from Paul Bearer, and the Undertaker could no longer fight. And he was fighting a 10-on-1 in the ring. But wait, the Paul Bearer gets the urn back, and Undertaker can suddenly fight again. But wait, they take it away from him again, and they beat the Undertaker to death. All 10 heels use their finisher on the Undertaker. It was a coffin match. They dump him in the coffin. Yokozuna wins the match. Then the heels start wheeling him down the aisle in the casket. Then the music and the lights play. The lights went back out, and the video wall came on, and there's a message from the Undertaker directly from inside the casket saying that he was about to die, but his spirit would live on forever, and eventually he would be back. He then closed his eyes as if to die, and the video showed the Undertaker's spirit leaving his physical body, and the special effect showed him levitating in midair and finally raising to the heavens with his arms spread wide, a la the crucifixion.
Somewhere,
wait. I will let you. I'll do that in a minute. Vince Russo, you saw that one coming, right? No, you didn't. Vince Russo is a very polarizing figure in the wrestling business, and I get that. But when you say Vince Russo ruined wrestling, go back and listen to what I just told you. That's what Vince Russo replaced. You really like that? That's what Vince Russo ruined for you? Think about it, kids. Get your facts in order. Sean, go right ahead.
Somewhere Kevin Dunn turned to a production assistant and said, "And you thought it was a dumb idea to put a camera in the casket."
That crossed.
Yeah,
the
I remember
line.
watching the Undertaker dying angle from the Rumble, and as he's getting destroyed by 10 guys that just went on forever, and just thinking, "Good God, this is so dumb." And boy, am I glad I'm watching this by myself. I don't know what I would have been able to say if a friend of mine who wasn't a wrestling fan was there to look at me and say, "Wow, you watch this every week and you actually paid for this show."
You would change this channel faster than you would like getting caught with porn.
Oh yeah,
getting caught watching a Doink match. You'd rather get caught having Nina Hartley on the screen rather than Doink.
Doink was another new low. But anyway, Max, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you for
Once
having
again,
me.
Another outstanding job by you. Sean, thank you for everything you do for the show. It's greatly appreciated. I want to thank everyone for listening, and I hope you tune in again next week. Not that you actually tune in, but it's an expression. And I also want to thank our producer, Lou Kippelman, for all the work he does. He's a big part of the show. And this has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network.